On the day that I walked into GT Inc. and was told that they had an all business, all the time dress code, I must admit that I panicked. Any doubt about the extent of their ideas about gender binaries were eliminated by the dress code worksheet in the new employee handbook, complete with the cartoon of a male in his standard slacks, button-down shirt and necktie, directly opposite a woman in a dress with the exact appropriate length marked in inches and heels. My decision to not comply with the gender codes at GT Inc. was a defining moment for all involved. When I raised my hand to clarify the question, so anytime we wear a dress shirt, we must wear a tie as well, right? The room went silent, and my trainer stared at me for a good 2 to 3 minutes and finally answered hesitantly, yes, the men do. Yes. I decided to ignore the men do part. And that's from First Boy by Carolyn Weisinger. And the third quote that I'll read is from Work to Do by Colby King. And he's talking here about being a first-gen student, kind of going into the workforce, first-gen and working class background as well. I was the first in my family to earn a bachelor's degree, the first to earn a graduate degree, and now I'm the first to have an office. In that office, over in Hart Hall, I have hung a sculpture that my brother made. The sculpture is dirty, the brush is rusty, and the glove is stained. It smells dusty. It doesn't quite fit in with the framed certificates and the glossy new books, but it's in my office to celebrate the work my family has done and the accomplishments my brother and I have made. Each day, my brother and I learn a little bit more about how to navigate the professional cultures in our fields, cultures that are different from the one in which we were raised. Neither of us has it figured out, but we are both making careful decisions about our career paths, and we both bring passion to our work. So what I want you to do is kind of do some thinking about this mythical norm and how you saw that operating in these different stories that I just read to you, and they'll be on the resources at the end. So now that I've told you all these things and you're like, oh, I have all these things to think about and all these things to fix about the career and the world of work, I'll help you out there. We're going to talk about how do we navigate these things. One question that I want to ask you just to kind of push you a little bit is who is inherently seen as professional? When you think of just professional, who is inherently seen as professional and who's not? And then how do we navigate those things? One of the articles that I absolutely love is by Dr. Terry Yasso, and she wrote it in 2005, and it's called Whose Culture Has Capital? Whenever I say capital, I'm talking about different forms of wealth. Does that make sense? So it's not just like money, it's different forms of accumulated wealth. So what she argues here, and I can kind of walk around here, what she argues here is that persons that fall outside of the mythical norm, here she's talking specifically about people of color, she's talking about first-gen students, have different kinds of wealth and resources. So they're not just coming into our institutions or coming into our workspaces with nothing, and then we have to kind of like teach them the ropes and teach them all of those things. She's arguing here that they already come with capital or with forms of wealth. And you can look and see the different kinds of forms of wealth here. And I'll explain a little bit more about some of those things. We're going to talk about linguistic capital and code switching. So what she says, I told you I love quotes. So what she says here is that linguistic capital is basically how we can switch and use different kinds of mastery of languages in different perspectives. So I want to tell you a story. This is one of my favorite stories. So I was talking to a student, and let's just say we share the same vernacular dialect. So I was talking to her, and we're talking about, you know, how to get away with murder and like who we think is gonna be, and we don't know. And this is very, you can think about it kind of like almost speaking another language. We were just in a different dialect. So I got a phone call. So, you know, we're talking. I got a phone call, and I picked up the phone, and I said, hello, this is Jade Perry speaking. And I went through with the call, and then I hung up the phone. She said, why do you have your work voice on, right? So again, we're thinking about linguistic capital and code switching and how we use either different languages completely or different kinds of English in different spaces. What Terry Yasso is saying here is that this is a form of wealth. What I'm adding on to that is this is a form of wealth that we can definitely use in the career workspace. And we can ask questions about what does it mean for us to use our linguistic capital in these spaces. So I like to do this experiment, and I just wanted to see, you know, kind of like, how do I do these things in workspaces? So what you can see, this is telling my business at Kansas State University. So what you can see here is I was making an appointment this day, and you can kind of see how that reads. Want to schedule an appointment, et cetera, et cetera. I know, especially for some of our college students, this is kind of drilled into you, like, this is what we do at the university, and you need to have a header, and you need to have a signature, and all of that is right, and that's all good. But then I talked to my family. The interesting thing is that this was to my mother, and I said, I scheduled this, I'm doing this, la, 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 la. This is to my brother who's 20 years old. Can anybody decipher what I'm saying here? Okay, so I'm on my way though. Like I'm en route is how I would say that here at Kansas State University. So here, this was a colleague from graduate school. This was we were texting each other. And I said, thanks for the message yesterday. It made my day truly. But here I'm using some kind of hashtag language, which is usually a Twitter thing. But sometimes anybody else put hashtags in their text? Okay, I didn't think I was the only one. Hashtag Black Scholars. Now, would I write that while I'm making my appointment? No, I would not. But we're using our kind of linguistic capital here. And this is one of my best friends. And we wanted to do dinner. So I said, what are you doing? We going to do dinner next week or not? So again, we're thinking about how are we using different languages. What I want you to do is pull out your phone for me. I usually never ask people to do this. Pull out your phone for me. What I want you to do is take about a minute or so and see how you're using your linguistic capital. Are things changing? Are you using different languages? Are you using different forms of language? Look and see kind of your trends in terms of more formalized language and then kind of your informal language. Just see what you notice. Let's do a quick time check here. Oh, we're good. I'll rely on your body language to tell me when you're good to go. Sounds like you're noticing some interesting things already. All right. Could you do me a favor and put your phones away again for me? Thank you. Going to be present in the space. I'm doing this thing of like being present. It's low-key stressful because I'm a texter, but for the most part, it's pretty good. So what did you notice? Who wants to tell me what they noticed? We can do volunteer or voluntold. Yes.
I noticed the way that I express laughter in my text.
How's that?
So when it was with a friend, I would be like, baha. Like, but then if it was like a colleague, I would just put smiley face.
Right.
LOL.
Right. You're like, let me tone it down, maybe. I think I saw a hand over here. Yes. Uh-huh.
Her and I, we have this really random text, like she'll send me memes, and so we respond back and forth all day.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So you're just using pictures kind of to communicate. Wonderful. Anybody else? Anybody notice that they're using completely different languages? Can you tell me about some of that? Anybody who wants to go? We'll go here and then we'll go here. Mm-hmm.
And the way I talk to them is like completely different.
Mm-hmm.
Like even my family, the text is like a thread, you think we're crazy. And then like classmates and work people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All three different.
Yeah. So it's interesting kind of because you're bringing forth kind of age as this salient social cultural identity here. Wonderful. We'll go with you and then we'll go with you.
Mine was with my brother.
Uh-huh.
I noticed that it's very different in the use of memes and also language like you're killing me smalls.
Mm-hmm. So those different kind of references that you know people will get. Wonderful.
I think people, a lot of students use Snapchat
Okay. Yeah, I had an intern that was like, we should do Snapchat. And I was like, Thank you for sharing that. Wonderful. So technology, how does that play a part? Let's get one more.
With coworkers, it's directly like, okay, where did you leave this? Or it's just direct questions versus like my mom who's sending me pictures of my cat and telling me, hey, this is what your daughter did today.
Right. So we're thinking about a specific purpose, right? So was that a hand or is that a stretch? Hand stretch. Or in the purple shirt in the back. Stretch. Okay. we did talk about hair a lot. So again, we're thinking about how we're code switching or how we're using our linguistic capital. Everybody does it. What I would submit to you is people that are navigating areas and spaces where race or gender or ethnicity are very different from their lived experiences are doing this almost times 2. So taking their own social cultural identities and saying, okay, how would I say this here? And then how much do I need to kind of code switch to even be in this space or feel validated in this space? And that's a very real thing. And we could get way into how that affects your brain and your cognition. We're not going to do that today, maybe next time. Navigational capital. So again, here Dr. Terayaso is saying there is a form of wealth when it comes to, particularly in her study, she's looking at people of color and she's looking at first-gen students, where it comes to navigating systems that are not inherently set up for their success. I'll say that again. So there's a particular kind of form of wealth when it comes to either teaching or learning how to navigate different systems that are not inherently set up for your success. What do I mean by like it's not inherently set up for your success? I always use this example. You can go through your university's history and just see when did they admit women? When did they admit students of color? When did they admit, et cetera, et cetera? And then when did these particular students get benefits? So when did you get that like really sexy program for first-gen students? And you know what I mean? So when are people getting these benefits? And that means that those persons were not inherently grafted into the vision of what that institution wanted at its inception. Does that make sense? If it makes sense, nod your head. If it doesn't, I don't know. Okay, wonderful. So what she's saying here is that that there's forms of wealth in being able to navigate these spaces. What I'm adding kind of and layering onto this theory is this works the same for the world of work. So she's doing this from a very higher education kind of standpoint. I'm talking about this within a career aspect. So it is asking those questions like, how should I wear my hair at work? Or I'm a woman and I want to go into the STEM field. How do I navigate what that might be like, what that might feel like, et cetera, and so on and so forth. So that's navigational capital, how we navigate some of those spaces. The interesting thing that I wanted to kind of call into the space here is that navigating a climate of racial ethnic diversity is more than a notion. Usually what we think about when we think about is a place diverse, is a company diverse, or is a school diverse, is just this box here. And you can see this is another theory. This is Hurtado et al. This is in 1999, but I use this for like everything. And usually we just think about the numbers. Is this diverse? I don't know. Let's see who's there, right? But as you can see from this model, that is not the only thing that goes into creating a climate for diversity. And when we talk about structural diversity, that's diversity as perceived through the numbers. We also have to layer onto that who's in leadership and who's not. And is that evenly distributed? Does that make sense, that structural piece? Cool. Then we've got the historical legacy of inclusion or exclusion. We already kind of talked about this. Who's inherently kind of set up to win in this particular system or company or career? And then we'll look at the historical legacy of exclusion. Where can you find some of those things? By researching the historical background of the company, by researching the field, by looking at the company mission, because language will tell you a lot about a lot. So you want to look at the company mission. You want to look who are the policies set up to inherently benefit? And where do we kind of have this legacy of almost exclusion or exclusivity? That's another piece of creating a climate for diversity. Now here they're talking about strictly racial ethnic diversity, but I'm sure you could kind of think about other ways that you can layer this on, whether that's gender or age or ability, et cetera, et cetera. The psychological climate, that's talking about the either perception or reality of exclusion or inclusion. Does that part make sense? So that it's either perceived or real. And how do you kind of discern that? Through informational interviews with others in the field or the company. And we'll dive really deep into this here. We'll be here for a little bit. And then there's the behavioral dimension. That's kind of how do people communicate across difference? Are there behaviors of inclusion or exclusion? And those are kind of generally easy to see. Let me take a quick pause to kind of read your faces and see if that makes sense and give you some examples on that. Okay, everybody looks like they're still with me. I'm good at reading. You know, you gotta read the rooms because sometimes people are like, I don't know. So how do we kind of layer this theory onto our career discernment process? Well, historical legacy, you wanna, again, like I said, you wanna do your research. You wanna come prepared to interviews with good questions about policies, about protocol, about any of those things so you can better discern what is the historical legacy of inclusion or exclusion. So are there any specific, this is one of my favorite questions to ask in interviews, are there any specific, keyword specific, policies that leadership can point to that assist the company's diversity and inclusion efforts? Because I want to know kind of like what are those things that you're kind of grafting into your company or your kind of field that you're trying to either swing this historical legacy towards more inclusivity. Structural, again, you want to, numerical representation that's real. That is a real thing. But you want to make sure that the organizational structure, you're paying attention to some of that and paying attention to what that tells you. So one of my favorite questions to ask is, what is your organizational structure? If I couldn't find it on the website, don't be out here asking questions you can find on the website. What is your organizational structure and how does that impact people day to day? That's an important question to ask. You want to make sure that you're kind of thinking about some of those things. The psychological climate. Again, that's kind of either the perception or the reality of inclusion or exclusion. You can talk to other people in the field or in the company, and I'm sure they can help you hear about informational interviews and what that's like and how to go about one. And I know there's a lot of advisors here that know a lot about that. So if you're like, I don't know what that is, and I want to do one, but I don't know. I see you, but I don't know. Ask one of the advisors so that you can get that assistance. Yes. Sure. So it's kind of like the data that we get for like admissions. We've got these many international students. We've got this many women students. So that's the structural. That's not necessarily the climate of diversity, but sometimes we like to say like, it's diverse because it's 25% international students. And that's an argument that can be made. I'm not downplaying that argument, but that doesn't speak to the overall climate. That's a good question. Thank you for asking that. I always tell my students, confusion is a choice. If you're not clear, ask a question so you can get clear. So psychological climate, that's thinking about either the perception or the reality of inclusion or exclusion. So you want to make sure that you're asking good questions. Where's the EEO statement? That's the Equal Employment Opportunity Statement. And that is the protection from the federal laws against discrimination based on your social cultural identities. And I could go through the whole list, but we already talked about social cultural identities. So kind of thinking about those things. Where is the EEO placed? If I have to do 10 million clicks on your website to find your EEO statement, that kind of says something. Now that doesn't say everything, but it does say something about what's that psychological climate for diversity. Does that piece make sense to everybody? Good. And then the behavioral dimension. Now that's where you'll have to kind of go in and see what do you notice in the interview process once you're there. Or you can do another informational interview to kind of ask some questions around that behavioral piece. Look at the benefits package. That's important. Who gets benefits? Who doesn't get benefits? Because that will tell you a lot about a company's behavior. It's written down. You can refer back to it. The EEO statement placement. Another thing that I look at in the behavioral dimension, I'm not saying that you have to look at this particular thing, but I usually look at if there's ever like a campus map or a corporate company map. I always look to see, are the ADA accessible ramps and things clearly highlighted, or do I have to kind of sneak through like the side and like figure out how this works? Again, that doesn't say everything, but that does say something about the climate for diversity in that particular company or that particular campus. So I know some of y'all are probably like, oh, maybe I want to kind of write these things down and think about these things. And it's good practice to start thinking about some of these things. So when we're navigating, again, these challenges with nuance, we want to think about social capital. Social capital is really kind of the forms of wealth that we get from each other. It's kind of like that who you know and kind of what can they share with you piece and the forms of knowledge that you get there. So you can navigate some of these questions with the socio-culturally focused lens. Some of the questions that I have asked explicitly: what are the unique challenges faced by women of color in academia? If that resonates with you, find somebody that can answer that question, or that can say, I don't know, but I'll help you find the answer to that question. What was your transition out of college like as a first generation student? What was that kind of like? I kind of read a quote that spoke to that. But again, you want to think about how can that social capital, how can we help each other answer some of these questions? You want to identify mentors. I can't state that enough. You want to identify mentors that will help you kind of figure out some of these things. And they don't have to have the same social cultural identity that you have. They just have to be able to kind of think about some of these things. Does that piece make sense? So identify those mentors that can help you do some processing around these things. And then use the resources that you already have here, whether that's career services centers and staff. I'll tell you, so when I graduated from Penn State the first time from my undergrad, I did not realize, I graduated and I did my thing, and I was like, I have to pay so much money to get those services that I could have gotten as a student at this institution by literally walking across campus. So you want to use the resources that you have now and thinking about some of those things. And ask these questions, because if they don't know, then they can help you find out the answer to those questions. Sorry, career services staff, I'm just like saying they can do this, but so you want to make sure that you are using the resources that you have. Again, identifying mentors in your field. I put those in two different places because there are probably mentors that you already have that you just need to cultivate a relationship with. If you know you've been talking to this professor about this one particular issue or multiple issues, and you want them to be your mentor, ask them. Kind of see what their policy is around that, if they will be open to that. So identify the mentors that you kind of think like, I already think this person will be a really good mentor for me. And then lastly, you want to research the trends in your field, research the trends in your prospective field. There are a lot of things I found out the hard way that I really could have found out by just doing a Google search. So you want to make sure that you're using your resources and researching your fields. And that's how you use your social capital or those forms of wealth to navigate some of these intersections between social cultural identity and career discernment. This is my favorite one. Resistant capital. So resistant capital is really, again, Dr. Tariasso is arguing here that particularly students of color who come into colleges and universities and first-gen students have this resistant capital. They've got navigational capital because they're kind of figuring out how do we navigate this world or the world of work or the institution, but they've also got some resistant capital, kind of thinking about what does it mean to critique or to challenge these norms, to challenge what Audre Lorde calls that mythical norm that caters to some of those identities that you saw before. So it's okay to challenge norms. You can think about, like, if there's a policy that is adding to that historical legacy of exclusion, maybe it's time to challenge that policy. Maybe it's time to ask more questions about that policy. Maybe it's time to give feedback to your employers or your employees, and since you're in school, to your professors even, or to the people that kind of you have day-to-day contact with. Maybe it's time to give some respectful feedback, respectful but firm feedback. I love respectful but firm feedback. That's my thing. Reporting lines in the company. Who do you report to when things just go completely off? When you know that you know that you know that you know that this particular instance or this particular thing was discrimination. Make sure that you know it beforehand. Who do I report that to? So you're not kind of working through your emotions and trying to figure out who do I report this thing to. So work some of those things out as well, especially for those of you who are seniors who are kind of going into a career, going into the workplace. You want to make sure you know what are some of those reporting lines. Understand your own rights and your laws. Understand what is okay. Understand what's not okay. And you can do that now. So if you go to an interview and people are asking you illegal interview questions, then you know something about that company and you have to understand your rights and your laws. Now, if that was news to any of you, you're like, there are illegal interview questions? Ask one of your advisors here and they'll tell you a little bit more about what those illegal interview questions are. Generally, however, they do have to do with your social cultural identity. So people should not be pressing kind of information about those things that are protected by federal law. Again, if you need kind of the breakdown, that's a whole advising session. So I'm going to let the advisors do what they do. But you need to understand your rights and your laws and what people can ask you and what people can't ask you in that space. And then through your own practice of professionalism. So that one is a little bit more esoteric and individualized because everybody can resist something in their own practice of professionalism. So I'll tell you how I do that, and then you can kind of think about how you do that. Is that a plan? Good plan? Okay, that's me. My resistant capital happens mostly through my professional dress. So I'm gonna come on this side because I feel like I've been like over here. Through my professional dress. So again, we talked a lot about like what do people wear in the workplace and who does that benefit and who does that exclude. So you want to, number one, research the question, what are the trends in your field? Is it all business all the time, like Gender Trouble Incorporated in our previous example? Is it business casual? Is it just casual? What are those trends in your field? And then ask yourself, what are the ways in which your social cultural identities, whatever they may be, so your gender expression, your age, your ability, et cetera, how have those things influenced your expression of professional dress? That's where you have to have a values conversation with yourself. What do you value? Dr. Tanisha Ford I just absolutely love her work. She does a lot of work on kind of the style choices of women of color in academia or in like the ivory tower. Katie Manthony, she has a blog called dressprofesh.com where that's really all she does is have that conversation on that website. She does a lot of stuff. But on that website, all she does is kind of talk about what do those kind of intersections look like of social cultural identity and professional dress. So this is how I resist. You will see some things in these pictures. That was me at a presentation maybe like 2 weeks ago. I think that was about a year ago. That was when I actually had hair. So you can think about some of those things. Some of these pieces are very much influenced by my social cultural identity and by my age. I will wear a Beyonce no shirt at a presentation because that is informed kind of by my social cultural experiences. So you can think about what are the ways that you have room to resist a norm, or what are those ways where you're like, I'm actually not gonna do that, I'm okay. Because both of those choices are valid. Some people are like, listen, I need this check, and that's okay too. But that's a way, resistant capital, or that form of wealth that kind of makes you able to resist some of that mythical norm and how that encroaches upon your professional identity. That is a way that you can kind of have that form of wealth. So again, I always just kind of like to tell my business at these things. So these are random pictures of me and how I dress for work sometimes. So now that we've talked about all of these pieces, I want to ask you the question, what stood out to you? Not a rhetorical question. I want to know, what stands out to you about either resistant capital or like the whole thing that you're like, this is kind of still, I'm working through this piece. What stands out to you?
I know somewhat with the dress and everything, because I think about, I guess, tattoos is like a big thing for me. I want to get some. I know people say it's unprofessional. I've seen pictures of doctors with full like sleeves and everything. And it's like it's hidden under their lab coat. Not lab coat, but just,
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
care and stuff.
Mhm.
And it's like, if I did have like a full sleep, what would people think of me?
Yeah, and I wish that was an easy question for me to answer. Like, they're gonna think this, and they're gonna be great. But I think oftentimes we do get in this mode, and I know this because I used to do career service. But we get in this mode where we're like, I want to tell you that like everybody's gonna be accepting and everybody's gonna be great. But that kind of does a disservice, right? Because that's not always the reality. So I'll tell you the story. So I work in higher education, and I work in the Office of Multicultural Student Success. There's some things I can kind of get away with in that particular field. Now, my mother, I was raised by a medical professional, and we were talking on the phone one day, and she was like, will you believe my intern came in with blue hair? I can't. So again, thinking about what are those fields and how do those fields inform, some of those things. That's why that research piece is important too. And that's why the values is equally as important. I know for me, one of my like absolute values was, if I had to change my hair from the way it naturally grows out of my head to work for you, this is not a thing. And that's a value that I have. That's not a value that everybody has though, because people have different circumstances. So again, thinking about like what, it sounds like you already did some of the research in terms of thinking about like it may be a little bit more formal, I'm still working through this, and then think about what are those value statements, and then think about your resistant capital. Are there ways around it that you either see now or maybe could see later by having some informational interviews with people who are working in the field? So that's my very complicated response. Not really an answer, but response to what you shared. Thank you for sharing that though. And yeah.
I guess it would go towards like salience and
Yeah.
ability, but there are a lot of non-traditional students at K-State.
Mm-hmm. What can you tell me? What does that mean?
Well, either they're married or they came in after 25.
Okay, so people that are outside of the 18 to 25 emerging adult.
Worked before they went to college.
Got it. Okay.
So it seems to me the primary group or trend is going to college right after high school, doing all that.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of that aspirational.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thinking about what can you achieve. Yeah.
I'm already working on stuff, and then like you have to fit into this like job mentality,
Mm-hmm.
which is really difficult.
Yeah, and that can be very overwhelming. Very, very overwhelming to think about, again, this kind of norm of age, and thinking about like what does age have to do when we're navigating an institution of higher learning and the career and working world. So again, I think it's thinking about some of those pieces, and I'm even challenged to think more about what does that piece look like. I think about it a lot from my vantage point because I just look effervescently younger than I am. But again, kind of thinking about what do those pieces look like. That's when we get into this kind of like, how do I don't know if I'm not projecting this onto you, but I don't know if you've ever had this kind of like, how do I kind of manage this identity? Like, do I bring the briefcase or do I bring the Beyonce nose shirt? So thinking of, is this reference going to be too dated? Am I going to date myself? And thinking about those are real concerns. And I think mentorship and informational interviews with people that have those similar experiences is like gold, because they can kind of walk you through not everyone's experience, but at least their experience of how they work through those things. Anything else stood out to anyone else? Yes, no, maybe. Yeah.
I think I advisor arts and sciences students, and so from the advisor's perspective, I think just really coaching them on the resistant capital piece. I've never thought about it from that lens before. So I think that is going to be a fun conversation to have with some students.
Yeah, Dr. Terry also was amazing, and she did a lot of layering with this particular theory, but I know what that struggle is like too, of being. I majored in undergrad, I majored in theater, creative writing, and communication arts and sciences. And they called it integrative arts because they were like, we need one thing to actually put on your degree. And every time when I was getting ready to graduate, people were like, well, what are you gonna do with your degree? I know some of you have probably already heard that question. Like, what are you gonna do with that degree? And I said, I'm gonna go integrate some art, I guess. But again, when we're thinking about like the implications and reflecting on how we can use theory, again, whatever theory it is, how we can use theory to work through some of these really tough questions. So now I'm gonna ask you, what questions do you still have for me? And then if I don't know, I'll say, I don't know. The person can answer. Yes.
As a non-traditional student, I've had jobs before. And how do you handle with an older generation kind of being a little underlying vicious towards you for being, under the age of 30?
I'll email you when I find out.
I've had that happen to me.
Yeah.
And I just want to know, how would you handle it?
Yeah. I'm like part ways joking and part ways serious when I say I'll email you when I find out. Some of it is, again, thinking about those value statements. And for me, this falls squarely in both navigational capital. So kind of how are other people navigating this space, and am I talking with them? Am I getting their stories? Are we sharing knowledge at social and navigational capital? And some of it is resistant capital. I told you before, like I am a fan of respectful but firm feedback. So if I feel like there's some ageism going on, I will probably be the one to be like, I maybe need you to check your assumptions about age. And I think if you say that in a respectful way, or sometimes it may not come out in ways that other people perceive as respectful. But that's a value statement that you have to kind of think about. Where do I want to use this capital to resist, and where do I want to just kind of navigate those spaces? So some days, I'll be honest with you, some days I don't feel like doing any kind of resisting of anything in any shape, in any form. So I wear my little blazer, and I'll bring my little briefcase, and I'll, try to maybe do a little smoky eye or something like that to kind of look age up, right? But sometimes I'm not doing all of that. And sometimes it's really about, have you checked your age privilege? Because that's the conversation that we need to have, especially if it's a recurring thing. Any other questions that you have?
What if we learned? What if I learned that one?
Is that a question that you have?
Yeah.
I don't know if I can answer that for you. You gotta figure out what you learned. I don't know what you learned.
I guess my question is like on a broad scale.
Yeah.
What is it that we overall covered? Like.
Yeah.
We jumped a lot.
We did.
It covered a lot of in-depth stuff.
Yes. Yes. You know what we learned? We learned that the career discernment process is not simple. That's what we learned.
Can you talk a little bit about what you see in terms of, I think especially gender? You talked about how our standard for so long has been a really, clear kind of, this is
binary,
how, yes, very binary. How can people who want to be more fluid figure out how to navigate that?
Yeah, again, I think that comes through some of those informational interview pieces. Reading about it is very helpful. There's a lot of places. I'll plug conditionallyaccepted.com. It's a great resource for that. It's more based on like academia and kind of operating within or outside of the gender binary within academia. That's very helpful. So reading about it, informational interviews, and again, doing that research and having that values conversation with yourself. One of the pieces that I read, this particular individual was like, yeah, I'm going to just make a choice, and we'll see how that happens. Some individuals, that might not be their approach. They might kind of want to have conversations with their supervisor or their employer about like, have you talked about why your new employee handbook is all situated around the binary? Now that's a Jade choice. I would probably do that, but not everybody feels comfortable doing that. So that's, again, that research and then that values piece, that question of values. And I think that is also a charge to people who work in the profession of career services to really start thinking about some of these things and figure out, what do we tell our students if we're presented, not if, but when we're presented with these questions, because they're very likely to come. Yes. We'll go, yeah.
So, was K-State the only organization or company that you applied for a job
No, no. Mm-mm. Nope.
Is there another way to find out besides the glassdoor.com? Like, looking into companies, you know, like how are they treat their employees, their turnover rate, like things that I would be concerned if I'm gonna be there seasonally.
Yeah,
or
yeah.
is
So,
there-
some of that you'll get that easily and some of it you won't, just full transparency. Some of that you'll get through kind of your networking with people that work there, having information on interviews with them. Some of that you'll get through what I'll tell you that I like to do is I like to kind of look at like the job, if they have a salary kind of out there, I want to know what that is, and then I compare those with other similar job descriptions in that particular field. So if I'm looking at retail and I want to do this particular thing in retail, then I'll look at what's your salary, if they're transparent about that, compare it, contrast it. And I will be the first one to be like, hey, so I see, yes, pardon my randomness, I am Jade Perry, I have a question about, I want to kind of add you into my network and I want to ask you some questions about insert whatever it is here, and then ask some of those questions there. So like you said, like some of it you can get online, but not everything is online. So some of it you may have to kind of do some face-to-face interaction. And again, using your resources here in terms of talking with the advisors, they've seen person after person after person after person after person after person that probably wants to go into that field or does seasonal work. And so ask them those questions of like, here's my concern, what are the resources that I have at my disposal? Because there might be something specifically for Kansas State University, an interface that you all have that maybe other places don't have. I know when I was working at another institute, we had contracted like a specific kind of Glassdoor type of thing, specifically for the students there. So you want to ask some of those questions. I think I saw another hand. Yes.
We have a question online.
Sure.
It says, in terms of linguistic capital, is it resisting to be your true self and use your real voice sometimes in the workplace?
Is it resisting? I think I would say yes. I don't know if that's what everybody would say, but Jade Perry would say yes. There are some times that I intentionally choose not to code switch because in that point, I'm going to say it how I feel it, and I'm going to say it in a dialect that's comfortable for me. So could you call that resistant capital? You probably could. Could you call that navigational capital? You probably could. So I think it's all a lot more kind of fluid than we think it would be. But if that person is getting that inkling, like, this is how I resist, then it probably is how they resist. And that's a good thing. Again, it's all about those values. Yeah.
One of my career goals is becoming a manager in a field where all the employees under me are mostly men. How do you propose me navigating maybe some harboring feelings about a woman leading them?
That's deep. That's deep. Yeah, no, I think, listen, we maybe have an offline conversation about that one. But I think one of the things that you can do, I think presentations like this are good because they bring those things up into your memory. I am a list person. So if there are things that you know right now sitting in your seat that you're like, maybe I need to have a conversation with this person about this thing, with this person about this thing, write those things down. If there are mentors that you have or that you can identify that are in a similar position, ask them some of those things. For me, reading is always a big thing for me. I've read you like a whole bunch of quotes and theories and all kinds of things. But now might be a good time to dig into some of those narratives around women in leadership. Who are those women that you know of that they may be celebrities, they may not be, but that are in leadership roles? And like, I'm a big biography person. I will read somebody's biography in a second because I want to see how they work through, some of those things. So I can't necessarily prescribe how you will work some of those things, but those are just some ideas that you might have. And again, talking with an advisor about specifically, I want to talk about what does it mean to those implications of sexism in this field. I think that's a worthy conversation to have, and maybe one that needs to happen both internally and with someone else that can kind of share with you. So I don't necessarily know step by step what that will look like for you, only you know that, but those are some general ideas of how you can work through that. And use all the resources that are, so if it's Career Center, good. If it's Counseling Center, good. If it's your professor, good. So use the ones that make sense for you. Yes.
So you said you're in career services, so do you work in like hiring people?
That's a good question. Now I don't work in career services proper. Now I work in, so formally, I work in multicultural student success within retention and access and kind of college transitions. Before that, I was doing multicultural student affairs, which is very different than multicultural student success, but it's a long conversation we'll have later. And before that, I was in career services. So I was a diversity program coordinator, graduate assistantship kind of fusion thing. Got there my first day and they were like, we want a new program, make it for us. And I was like, okay, try not to get fired. But in my work now, I do hire particular student interns, and I'm responsible for a lot of like job processes. So I'm very familiar with both like kind of the like counseling aspect of career services, but also the hiring and unfortunately sometimes the firing. But yeah, is that a good answer to your
I had
question?
another question
Sure.
onto that.
Yes.
So when people go through like interview process and
Mhm.
working on hiring someone,
Mhm.
are you supposed to give a reason or like a write-up on why you didn't hire a particular person?
That's a good question. I think so. Each company is gonna have different policies around that, which is why I'm like, ooh. Every company has very different policies around what that looks like. Generally, if someone asks, now this is Jade Perry. If someone asks Jade Perry, like, why wasn't I hired for this position? I take fastidious notes in the interview process on like what things maybe they could work on so that I can give it more experienced feedback. I do think it's telling you something when you ask that question and they're like, well, because we didn't, right? So I've asked that question before as well. And I knew things almost intuitively when I walked into that space, but I really, really knew things once I got feedback that was very elusive. It wasn't around like, we interviewed a lot of candidates and we just felt that someone was stronger, for this reason, or maybe your interview skills, or maybe you were just having an off day at your interview. Those things are helpful to know. They're helpful feedback. But when I'm getting kind of the runaround of like, well, it does tell you something. And I think that's the question behind the question that you're asking.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I have no idea where we are on time, to be honest. Okay. Because I was like, I could keep asking more questions. I don't know if there's more questions in the room. I'll kind of look to you to.
It seems very natural right here.
Okay.
I think you've had some great questions and
Perfect.
covered a lot in an hour.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I want to ask you is, how will you put this into practice? That's the most important part. So again, when we think about like, yes, you may be here because you have to write a paper on this, but I am not a fan of people wasting my time. So I will go to really any discussion anywhere and be like, this is how I'm going to put this into practice. So that's a question that you need to answer. And you can answer it in this space or outside of this space, about how will you use what you learned, even if that's just to make you more sensitive to what your peers are going through. Because that's another way you can put it into practice as well. So thank you all for your time. If you have more questions, I'll be around generally, but I will release you into whatever it is that you have planned for the rest of your day. Thank you so much.